The silence in Marco Nelson's mansion was a living thing, heavy, expensive, and sterile. Every impeccably white corridor, every piece of art hung with millimeter precision, all screamed control. But the epicenter of this silence was the upstairs room, a medical suite that had once been a little girl named Ava's bedroom. Now, it was a sanctuary of technology and despair. Marco opened the door, as he did every night, expecting the same sound as always, the soft beep of monitors that were the only proof his daughter was still here. But that night, something was different. There was movement. In the dim light, illuminated only by the blue glow of the equipment, a small boy was moving. It wasn't a dance learned in classes. It was a rhythmic sway, arms circling in slow arcs, head tilted as if listening to music no one else could hear. Marco felt his blood run cold. Who was this child? How dared he enter here, into this sacred space of pain? He was about to shout, to call security, when his eyes fixed on his daughter's face, Ava Kang. She lay still on the bed as always, but there was a damp trail on her cheek, a single tear. Her eyes, which had been empty and distant for months, were fixed on the small figure dancing for her. How was this possible? Where are you watching this story from today? Tell me in the comments. And if you believe in the power of human connection, subscribe now so you don't miss what happens next. My name is Sujin Koster, and the boy dancing in that room is my son Lucas. Before he was the boy who made a billionaire weep, he was just my Lucas. The world has many words to describe him. Autistic, nonverbal, challenging. But to me, he has always been a melody on a frequency most people can't tune into. I remember the day of the diagnosis. I was sitting on an uncomfortable chair in a beige room, while a man in a white coat, Dr. Samuel Francois, talked about spectrums and deficits. He used charts and pointed to areas of the brain. Each word was a spade of cold earth thrown onto the hope I had. I looked at Lucas, who was on the floor, perfectly happy, tracing the carpet pattern with his finger. He wasn't broken. He didn't have a deficit. He was just in his own universe, a place far more interesting and textured than that beige room. Society, however, didn't see his universe. It only saw what he didn't do. He didn't respond when called. He didn't make eye contact in the way they expected. He didn't play with the other boys at the park. Instead, he'd spend hours watching dust dance in a sunbeam or feeling the rough texture of a tree's bark. The other mothers, like Olivia Wang and Gia Lambert, would look at me with pity, sometimes irritation. Their children ran and shouted, and Lucas stood still, rocking back and forth, his hands flapping softly near his ears. "Is he okay?" they'd ask. But the real question was, what is wrong with him? That rocking, which doctors called stimming, was his language. It was how he processed a world that was too loud, too bright, and too unpredictable. It was how he found his center, his peace. Over time, the rocking evolved. It became more complex, more graceful. It became his dance. He danced when he was happy, spinning in circles with a smile that lit up his face. He danced when he was anxious, with short, repetitive movements that anchored him in the present. He danced when he was overwhelmed, a storm of motion that released the tension words couldn't express. To the world, it was strange. To me, it was poetry. But living with poetry in a world that only values prose is exhausting. I lost friends. Family members like my cousin Tuan Hughes Khan gave unsolicited advice, suggesting restrictive diets, intensive therapies, anything to make him normal. They didn't understand that trying to force Lucas to be normal would be like asking a bird to stop singing. It would be stealing his essence. My job as a cleaner in medical facilities was what paid our bills. It was an invisible job, perfect for a mother who felt invisible. No one noticed me cleaning the polished corridors, emptying the bins of important doctors' offices. This invisibility allowed me at times to bring Lucas with me when I had no other option. He'd stay quiet in a corner with his headphones on and a small object to spin in his hands. Most of the time it worked, but Lucas was drawn to patterns, lights, and soft sounds. And Marco Nelson's medical wing was a feast for his senses. That's how he found Ava. I was cleaning the corridor, my back to the slightly ajar door of her suite, and when I turned, he was no longer there. My heart stopped. I found him inside the room, standing in the center, mesmerized by the blue glow of the monitors. And then, he began to move. His dance. Not to show off, not to entertain. It was a response. A silent conversation with the lights, with the heavy silence of the room, with the still girl on the bed. I didn't know her father was at the door. All I saw was my son, in his world, sharing a piece of his soul. And in that moment, before the billionaire's anger and confusion, I saw only the pure beauty of it. A boy speaking with his body to a girl who couldn't move hers. Marco Nelson was a man who believed in solutions. If a problem existed, it could be solved with money, power, or the right person. When the accident stole his daughter Ava's movement, he declared war on paralysis. He wouldn't accept doctors' prognoses. He would build a new prognosis, one paved with his money. That's how Filippo Garcia Simon entered their lives. Filippo didn't present himself as a doctor, but as a neurological architect. He was a charming man with a polished speech and impressive graphics. He spoke of neuroplasticity, of brain-computer interfaces, of algorithms that could remap Ava's neural pathways. He promised not a miracle, but science, expensive, exclusive, and, according to him, infallible science. Marco clung to this promise with the force of a drowning man. He poured millions into Filippo's clinic, which was installed within his own home. Ava's suite was transformed into a laboratory. Electrodes, screens, robotic arms. The girl disappeared under a tangle of wires and technology. Filippo and his team, including the skeptical assistant Maya Stefan, worked with a chilling efficiency. The therapy sessions were brutal in their impersonality. Ava was hooked up to machines that moved her limbs mechanically. Screens flickered with complex patterns, meant to stimulate her brain. Filippo measured every micro-movement, every fluctuation in brain activity, and presented Marco with reports filled with encouraging data. You see, Mr. Nelson, a 0.8% increase in ulnar nerve response. We are on the right track. Marco, desperate for good news, saw what he wanted to see. He saw the graphs rising, not the light dimming in his daughter's eyes. He failed to notice that Ava was becoming less a person and more a subject of study. Her laughter, which once filled the house, was replaced by the hum of machines. Her toys were put away to make space for rehabilitation equipment. The hope Filippo sold was a potent drug, and Marco was addicted. He ignored the signs. He ignored the way Ava seemed to shrink when Filippo approached. He ignored the lack of any genuine emotional response. The medical staff, including Nurse Elise Yilmaz, who had a genuine fondness for Ava, voiced veiled concerns. She seemed so tired, Mr. Nelson, Elise would say, carefully. But Filippo was quick to dismiss these observations as unscientific sentimentality. For him, emotion was a dirty variable that interfered with the data. Filippo's world was made of certainties, of absolute control. He disdained the unpredictable, the immeasurable. That's why when Marco told him about the autistic boy dancing in Ava's room, Filippo's reaction was one of pure disgust. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice cutting. "A contamination of the controlled environment. This boy with his erratic behaviors poses a risk. He may have overloaded her senses, caused a stress spike that you've mistaken for an emotional response." He used terms like motor stereotypy and sensory processing deficit to describe Lucas's dance. He reduced it to a neurological glitch, a symptom to be managed. He recommended banning the cleaner and her problematic child from the property permanently. To Filippo, Lucas wasn't a person. He was an error in the system. And Marco, still, under the spell of Filippo's false hope, almost agreed. He was ready to erase that strange moment, to retreat to the safety of data and charts. But the image of the tear on Ava's cheek wouldn't leave him. It was the only data, in months, that felt real. Marco Nelson's initial anger was like a wildfire. He turned to me, Sujin, his eyes flashing. "What is he doing here? Who gave you permission?" My invisibility had dissolved. I was, suddenly, the mother of a threat, the janitor who had broken the most sacred rule of that house, not to disturb the fragile order built around a father's pain. I stammered an apology, trying to explain that Lucas had slipped away, that he was harmless. But my words got lost in the sterile corridor. Filippo Garcia Simon appeared beside Marco, his face a mask of professional disdain. He didn't look at me, but at Lucas, like an entomologist examining a peculiar insect. "Marco, we need to remove this distraction immediately," he said, his voice low and authoritative. Ava's environment needs to be aseptic, not just physically, but sensorially. His presence is detrimental. The word distraction hit me like a slap. My son, my entire universe, reduced to an inconvenience. The human conflict of that scene was palpable. On one side, a billionaire father clinging to control and science as his only salvation. Beside him, an arrogant specialist who saw people as data sets. And on the other, me, a mother with nothing but fierce love for my son, a boy the world insisted on misunderstanding. Marco was ready to follow Filippo's advice. His hand was already moving to call security. But then, he looked into the room one more time. Lucas had stopped dancing and was now sitting on the floor, near the bed, simply looking at Ava. And Ava, who wasn't responding to Filippo's expensive, calculated stimuli, had her eyes fixed on Lucas. The tear was still there, glistening under the blue light. "Wait," Marco said, the word sounding strange amidst the tension. He approached the bed, his heart pounding. He looked at the monitors. Ava's heart rate, usually monotonous, showed a slight, almost imperceptible acceleration. Her oxygen saturation was a point above normal. These were data crumbs, insignificant to Filippo's algorithms, but to a father starved for any sign of life, it was a feast. Filippo huffed, impatient. "Marco, this is a statistical anomaly. Stress. Don't mistake it for progress." But the seed of doubt had been planted. Marco looked at Filippo, then at me, and finally at the two children. One who had everything but couldn't move. The other who had nothing, but moved with a freedom money couldn't buy. The dilemma on his face was evident. Follow Filippo's safe, expensive, and unrewarding path, or take a risk on something he didn't understand? Something his specialist's science called contamination? He looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't see a cleaner, but a mother. "What's his name?" he asked, his voice softer. "Lucas," I replied, my chin trembling. He likes lights, patterns." Marco nodded, absorbing the information. He turned to Filippo. "Let them stay. For now." Filippo's expression was one of shock, then contained fury. "This is a mistake, Marco. You're compromising months of work for a sentimental whim." But Marco didn't waver. He saw the panicked look on my face and added, speaking to me, "He can come back. Tomorrow. Half an hour. Under supervision." It was a decision that defied all his logic, all his need for control. It was the first brick pulled from the wall he had built around his heart. In that cold corridor, under the doctor's furious gaze and a mother's hopeful look, a billionaire decided to bet not on technology, but on a silent dance. He didn't know it, but this wasn't a bet. It was a surrender. Lucas's first official visit was strange. I, Sujin, was nervous, feeling the stare of Marco Nelson and, occasionally, that of Filippo, who watched from afar with a scowl. But Lucas didn't feel the tension. For him, that room was simply a space with interesting lights and a calm presence on the bed. He didn't enter dancing. He walked slowly around the room, touching the cold surface of a machine, watching the rhythmic blink of an LED. Then he sat on the floor, in the same spot as before, and took a small, polished wooden cube from his pocket. He began to spin it between his fingers, completely absorbed. Marco, impatient, whispered to me, "He's not going." "To dance?" "He only dances when he feels he should," I replied. "It's not a performance." And so they stayed, for 30 minutes. A boy spinning a cube and a girl watching him. In the end, nothing spectacular happened. No miracle. Filippo smiled smugly as they left. "I told you, Marco. A waste of time." But Marco wasn't so sure. He noticed that during those 30 minutes, Ava's face seemed less tense. It was a start. The shift wasn't an event, but a quiet process. Day after day, Lucas came. Sometimes he danced, other times he just sat or hummed a wordless melody. He never tried to make Ava speak or move. He never demanded anything from her. He simply shared his space, his presence. Marco began to spend more time observing these sessions. He started asking me questions. Why does he flap his hands like that? And I'd explain about sensory overload. Why doesn't he look me in the eye? And I'd explain that, for Lucas, eyes were too intense, and he heard better when he didn't have to. Process a face. Marco, the magnate who commanded meetings with world leaders, was taking lessons on autism from a cleaner. And he was listening. The quiet shift truly happened on a rainy afternoon. Lucas was dancing, a slow, fluid dance, as if moving underwater. He was facing the large window where raindrops traced winding paths. Ava, from her bed, could see his reflection in the glass. And then, it happened. With an effort that made her entire body tremble, Ava moved the fingers of her right hand, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. But I saw it. And Marco, who was standing in the corner, saw it too. He held his breath. It wasn't a response to an electrode or an algorithm. It was a response to the dance, to the rain, to Lucas's presence. It was a human response. In that moment, Marco looked at the stack of Filippo's reports on his desk. Graphs, percentages, projections. Everything seemed hollow, lifeless. Filippo had promised to remap Ava's brain, but Lucas, with no tools, but himself, had touched her soul. Later that night, Marco dismissed Filippo early. He went into Ava's room alone and sat beside her bed. He didn't turn on any machines. He just held her hand and, for the first time in a long time, spoke to her not as a project to be fixed, but as his daughter. He told her about his day. He talked about Lucas. He talked about the rain. He didn't expect a response. He was just learning to be present, just as the autistic boy had taught him. The unexpected help didn't come from a Swiss lab or cutting-edge technology. It came from a boy the world considered broken, but who possessed a form of wisdom Marco's wealth couldn't buy. The shift was this realization. The healing wasn't in fixing what was broken, but in finding a new way to connect. The victories began small, like green shoots breaking through concrete. One day, as Lucas hummed his wordless melody, Ava made a sound, a soft but audible sigh. The nurse, Elise Yilmaz, who was checking the monitors, looked at Marco with wide eyes. It was the first sound she had made in almost a year. Marco felt his chest tighten. Filippo, when informed, dismissed it. A diaphragm reflex, irrelevant. But to Marco, it was music. Another time, Lucas brought a leaf he'd found in the garden, fascinated by its intricate veins. He held it near Ava's face, not for her to take, but just to share his wonder. Ava's head, which always faced the same direction, moved a centimeter to the left, her eyes trying to follow. The leaf, a small victory. Marco began to record these moments in a journal, not with graphs but with words. Today, Ava smiled, or I think it was a smile. The corner of her mouth lifted when Lucas spun in circles. He was learning to see the beauty in the details, in achievements that couldn't be quantified. He also changed how he interacted with Lucas. At first, he saw him as a tool, a mysterious key to unlock his daughter. Now he saw him as a boy. He discovered that Lucas loved the mango, juice the mansion's kitchen made. He started ensuring there was always a glass waiting for him. One day, he brought a crystal prism for Lucas. When the sunlight hit it, the room filled with rainbows. The joy on Lucas's face was so pure, so contagious, that Marco found himself truly smiling for the first time in months. And looking at the bed, he saw that Ava was smiling too, an unmistakable smile that reached her eyes. That was a big victory. The contrast between the two worlds became stark. Filippo's sessions were tense, silent, and filled with the hum of machines. Lucas's visits were calm, filled with silent movement, improvised music, and a sense of peace. Maya Stefan, Filippo's assistant, began to observe Lucas's sessions with a curiosity bordering on admiration, her initial skepticism dissolving. Marco himself underwent a transformation. He used to walk through the house with the rigidity of a general. Now he moved with more ease. He'd stopped to look at the flowers in the garden. He learned to sit in silence without the need to fill it with business or plans. Lucas, without saying a word, was teaching everyone in that house a new language, that of acceptance, patience, and connection without expectation. The greatest victory, however, came from Ava. The physiotherapist, following Marco's new orders to incorporate music and gentle movement, was working with her. During the session, Lucas walked in and began his dance. Inspired, the physiotherapist took Ava's hand and tried to guide her in a movement that mimicked Lucas's. And then, on her own, Ava squeezed the therapist's hand, lightly, but with intent. It was a request to join the dance. Everyone in the room held their breath. It wasn't a cure. It wasn't a miraculous recovery. It was communication. It was participation. It was Ava, stepping out of her silent prison, not into the noisy world of before, but into the gentle, rhythmic world Lucas had introduced her to. That night, Marco looked at the old photo of Ava on his desk, a little girl running in a field full of life. The pain of loss was still there, but it was mixed with something new. Gratitude. Gratitude for these small victories, for this new kind of joy, a quieter but perhaps deeper joy. Marco Nelson's transformation was profound, but it didn't happen overnight. It was a slow erosion of his old certainties. He used to believe the world was a clockwork mechanism, complex but decipherable. If a piece broke, you replaced it or fixed it. His daughter in his mind was a broken piece. Filippo was the master clockmaker he hired to fix her. Lucas, with his dance and his silence, didn't fit this worldview. He was a paradox. He was, in the eyes of society, more broken than Ava, and yet, he was the one bringing the healing. Marco began spending his evenings reading, not financial reports, but books on neurodiversity, articles on nonverbal communication, biographies of people who lived on the autistic spectrum. He was trying to understand Lucas's universe, not to use it, but simply to appreciate it. He realized that in his desperate pursuit of a cure, he had become as mechanical as Filippo's machines. He issued orders, demanded results, measured progress. He had stopped being a father and become the CEO of his daughter's illness. He remembered what it was like before the accident. He was always busy, always on a call, always planning the next deal. He bought Ava the best toys, enrolled her in the best schools, but how much time did he actually spend with her? How much time did he spend just being? Lucas's presence in Ava's room was a mirror. The boy didn't try to fix, entertain, or change Ava. He just was. His presence was a gift without conditions. And Marco realized that was what his daughter needed all along. Not a fix, but a connection. Not an expert, but a father. One evening, he was sitting beside Ava's bed while Lucas was on the floor, arranging colorful pebbles in a complex pattern. Marco looked at the boy's concentrated face and then at his daughter's serene face. And he understood. Lucas's world wasn't a deficit, it was a focus, an ability to see beauty in details most people overlook, a brutal honesty, free from the layers of social pretense. He lived in a state of pure truth, and that truth was what was reaching Ava in her silent place. Marco's most painful reflection was on Filippo. He saw that the specialist wasn't just a charlatan, he was a reflection of Marco himself. Filippo's arrogance, his belief that everything could be controlled and measured, his impatience with human fragility. These were all traits Marco saw in himself. Hiring Filippo wasn't just a misjudgment, it was an act of narcissism. He had chosen a man who thought like him, who validated his belief that money and power could bend reality to his will. His daughter's illness proved him wrong, and an autistic boy was showing him the right way. Acceptance came in a moment of quiet. Marco dismissed everyone. He stayed alone with Ava and Lucas. Lucas was asleep on the rug, exhausted. Ava was also asleep, her breathing soft and regular. Marco looked at the two children, and a sense of peace washed over him. The pain hadn't disappeared. The tragedy hadn't been erased, but the struggle had. He stopped fighting reality. He accepted that his daughter might never run in a field again, but she could smile. She could feel the presence of a friend. She could connect, and that was everything. He leaned down and kissed Ava's forehead. "I love you," he whispered. And for the first time, he didn't feel the desperation to have her respond. He just felt the love. The culmination of it all happened at the annual Nelson Foundation Gala, an event that gathered the elite of philanthropy and science. That year, Marco had renamed it the Gala for Human Connection. The ballroom was resplendent, filled with distinguished guests like Ivan Rodriguez McGregor and Victoria Sokolov. The atmosphere was one of anticipation. Everyone knew about Ava Nelson's tragedy and was eager to hear about the miraculous advancements promised by the renowned Filippo Garcia Simon, the keynote speaker. Filippo strode onto the stage with the confidence of a conqueror. He smiled at the audience, adjusted his microphone, and began his speech. "Ladies and gentlemen, medicine is at a turning point. We have overcome the limitations of the human body through the power of data, the precision of algorithms. He displayed complex graphs on the giant screen behind him, showing spikes in neural activity, percentage improvements in motor responses. These were the same charts he showed Marco, but now polished for public consumption. He was the embodiment of false hope, selling a cold, technological cure to a captivated audience. Mid-sentence about synaptic optimization, Marco stood up from his table in the front row and walked calmly to the stage. A murmur went through the hall. Filippo stopped, confused and irritated. "Marco, is there a problem?" Marco took a microphone from the lectern. "Dr. Garcia Simon, your data is impressive," he said, his voice firm and clear, "but it only tells part of the story. Allow me to show you the rest." With a nod to the technical crew, the giant screen behind Filippo changed. The graphs disappeared, replaced by a live feed from Ava's room. The audience gasped. There was Lucas Nkrumah, in the midst of one of his most expressive dances, a whirlwind of silent joy. And on the bed lay Ava. Her eyes were bright, alive, and then, before hundreds of witnesses, she raised her left hand. The movement was slow, hesitant, but unmistakable. She extended her fingers towards Lucas, and a wide, genuine smile lit up her face. The collective reaction was a wave of shock and emotion. People leaned forward, whispering. Some, like philanthropist Zain Dumitrescu, had tears in their eyes. Filippo went pale, his jaw clenched. He looked at the screen, as if seeing a ghost. This is an anomalous response," he stammered. "It's called happiness, doctor," Marco said, his voice cutting. He then turned to the audience. "For months, Dr. Garcia Simon showed me charts like these, assuring me we were making progress. What he didn't tell me was that he was manipulating the data, amplifying insignificant muscle twitches and logging them as voluntary movements to justify his exorbitant fees." The scandal erupted in the hall. Murmurs turned into a buzz of indignation. Maya Stefan, Filippo's former assistant who was in the audience, just nodded her head, confirming the accusation. Filippo was exposed, humiliated, his empire of data crumbling live. Marco continued, "My daughter's true therapy didn't come from machines or algorithms. It came from this boy, Lucas, whom the doctor called contamination. He taught us that healing isn't in rewriting our code, but in connecting with each other, honestly and without judgment." He announced that all the money raised that night, and a significant portion of his own fortune, would go towards establishing a new center, a center for integrative therapies, which would combine science with art, music, and human connection. And its first director, Marco announced with a smile, will be Lucas's mother, Miss Sujin Koster, alongside therapist Elise Yilmaz. I, Sujin, who was seated at a back table, felt my eyes well up with tears. The audience rose to their feet and applauded, not for the billionaire, but for the idea, for the hope he represented. Security discreetly approached Filippo, who stood frozen on stage, his face a mask of defeat. As they led him away, humiliated before his peers and sponsors, Marco turned back to the microphone one last time. He looked at the screen, where Ava's hand now gently touched Lucas's arm. He addressed everyone, but his words seemed meant for himself, a summary of all he had learned. His final remark was short, elegant, and unforgettable. He didn't fix her. He found her. The final image on the screen, the silent connection between the two children, became the symbol of that night, a perfect miniature of the truth. Power wasn't in perfection, but in acceptance. True wealth wasn't what you could buy, but what you could feel. Lucas and Ava's story reminds us of a simple truth. In today's noisy world, we often forget to listen to the quieter languages of the heart. They show us that the deepest connections don't need words. Sometimes, all we need is someone who dances in our silence. If this story touched you in any way, please like, comment with the name of someone who inspires you, and subscribe to the channel. You never know who might need to hear a message of hope like this today. By sharing, you help this light reach even more people. Thank you for being part of our community.